Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for coming to our session on fake news and echo chambers. How can we stop the spiral? Before we get started, I wanted to mention that this is the fourth in a series on lessons from Charlottesville through a critical lens. So far, the series have covered free speech versus hate speech, how to make real social change, how monuments reflect our shared history, and then today we're talking about fake news and echo chambers. And then I wanted to let you know that next week on the same day, at the same time at 4:30 up here in Gorecki 204, we'll be envisioning country and campus anew, and this will be basically a session, a working session on how to move forward. So I encourage all of you to come to that as well. All these sessions are sponsored by the Intercultural Directions Council, and they were developed to help us to reflect upon the events of past summer. So the organization of our session is Dr. Kelly Berg is going to start by talking about what is fake news, why it's relevant, and then how the mass media industry changes have opened us up to fake news. Then we'll move into talking about our role and the psychology behind it. We'll discuss political and social implications and then where we can go from here. And then we're also hoping to have some nice discussion afterward. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Kelly Berg, who will talk about what is fake news and the media's role.
Okay, hi. My job here is just to start off just making sure we're on the same page when we're talking about fake news, because we can see people talking about it from different perspectives. So we've narrowed it down to a specific focus for this particular session, though we can broaden that if you want to during the discussion session. The first thing that we wanted to do is try to differentiate the intentions of fake news from traditional news. Some of the ways that we can do that is to look at the goals of fake news. The goal is to distract rather than inform us. We can presume that traditional news is intending to inform us. And while traditional news may be aimed at gaining ad dollars, they're not trying to do it in the same particular way. The goal here is only to gain viral clicks. To flood news feeds with confusing and conflicting information. We see this a lot with the political perspectives and an attempt to distract us from focusing on important issues. And then bolstering a distrust of mainstream news and fact-checking. That also has political implications. For our session, we're going to be looking at information that is disguised as news, that is either propaganda, lies, intentional half-truths, or aimed at unmaking truths. An example of the unmaking truths would be attempts years ago to try to convince Americans that former President Barack Obama was not born in this country. It was taking a truth and attempting to unmake that. One example of fake news that we might look at, now this one's not related to Charlottesville, but we can see this as a specific type of example where a website is created that appears to have a real news sounding name. This one is from the Denver Guardian. The Denver Guardian is a website that published a fake story saying that an FBI agent who was looking into Hillary Clinton's use of a private email server killed himself, murdered his wife, and set their house on fire. There was no truth to this story. In fact, the person who owned the website, this is an NPR investigative report, looked into this story to find out how it got started and who's propagating this. This particular story is owned by, this site was created by a man who owns and has created numerous fake news sites. He does it, or he said that he does it, because he wants to point out the fake news problem, and he particularly feels that trying to do this he claims to be politically left, and that he is trying to point out the problem in the alt-right political community. He says, though, that he's going to continue to do it because of ad dollars and because they have tried to gain viral clicks through politically left audiences, but have had no luck getting those stories to be spread. Anyway, so just one example of the kinds of things that we can maybe not notice because it sounds like the real arm of a real news site, the Denver Guardian, but it's not. So why should we care? One of the reasons that we should care about this topic is that fake news affects our perceptions. It affects our ability to make informed decisions in a democracy. We need rational decision-making, which requires access to truthful information. It affects our social relationships and our ability to act civilly with other people. A key to fake news is trying to get us emotional, get people riled up so that they will share it. And it affects our ability to learn new and correct information. News studies have shown that even when news organizations correct misinformation that they've given us, we remember the misinformation rather than the correct information. And Dr. Bohn-Gettler is going to talk more about the psychology behind that. There are connections, obviously, to Charlottesville, and that's part of the reason that we're here. The impact and significance of stories like How I Became Fake News, the videographer of the person who ran over a protester. He gave the video to he posted it online, and people started making up stories about this person. Said that he was a CIA agent who was intending to sow American unrest and through a race war. He does have a federal background, and he does have foreign intelligence experience, but he was not a CIA agent intending to foment unrest. But the importance of this is that he experienced death threats, and so did his family. How prevalent is fake news? We see it talked about. We know that the media can make something small seem like it's a big deal even when it's not. But a number of 2016 sources have shown us that fake news actually outperformed real news in terms of views, impressions, and almost a quarter of people say that they shared up a made-up news story. A number of them, as we can see on the bottom, 14% said they knew that it was fake, and another 16% said that they knew later that it was fake after they shared it. Where are we accessing fake news? We're accessing it on social media, as we know, and we see in traditional mainstream media reports. A study by the Columbia Journalism Review found that 30% of all fake news traffic could be linked to Facebook. If we compare that to traditional news, only 8% of traditional news is linked back to being viewed through Facebook. So we can see that social media is a common spreader of it. More recently, with Las Vegas shooter, we had some more fake news. Google and YouTube, which is owned by Google, also had a role in sharing quite a bit of the fake news based on their algorithms. Traditional media also does play a role. They bring on a lot of people who have particular political agendas, and they spew false information. And it often goes uncorrected in traditional media. Family and friends share. Because we trust them, we spread information that they've shared with us. And then people who participate in online political groups and discussions also tend to spread false news. So let's just talk about the role of the media. There's a number of things that we don't hear about from the mainstream media, and that's partly intentional by the media. I'd like to talk about the changes in the media industry that have been happening over the last couple of decades, how the norms of journalism have changed and how they influence the kind of information that we've been getting and let fake news take a hold. And then how social media has offered new threats and opportunities to journalism and the media industry that have led to what we're seeing now. So the goal of media, as most of us know, is to make money. The media's aim is to bring us together to be exposed to advertising. And as they consolidate, as we moved from 50 to 20 to 11 and to now 7 major media companies, they are trying to make more money through economies of scale. As they get larger, they look for ways to save money. And one of the most common ways to do that is to eliminate some employees. Layoffs are very common. Newsrooms are one of the first places to suffer, which means if we lay off a lot of journalists, the quality of the news we're getting also has reduced. Even the St. Cloud Times locally has gone through these sorts of cuts, as Gannett, which is a newspaper chain, newspaper company that owns St. Cloud Times and newspapers across the country. They've gone on a buying spree, attempting to grow bigger, but as they have also seen ad revenues drop and they've needed the money to do this, they've laid off just last year alone, and this has been the last several years annually, laid off 2% of their employees. In St. Cloud, the effect was that 2% across the U.S. In St. Cloud, though, the effect was the loss of about 7 employees at one time just last year alone. So for a small newspaper to lose a significant number of employees is pretty challenging for us to get quality news. The people who are usually let go are the people who have more experience and are more expensive as well. So of course, again, we're relying on new reporters to give us the news and to do fact checking, which they may not know yet how to do well. So fewer news outlets, fewer reporters means fewer alternatives for news until we have social media. So social media now has a bigger role for us in the news environment. Another way that the shrinking newsrooms has been affected is the increase in public relations professionals. We actually have more public relations professionals than we have journalists. They're paid better, typically, than many journalists. They have more time to focus on their one area. Public relations can be on behalf of a company, it can be on behalf of politicians, but they now don't have to make friends with the media. They can go straight to the public through social media, and there's plenty of room for that because we don't have the journalists able to step up and correct all of the misinformation that may be coming through those outlets too. I said I wanted to talk a little bit about the norms of journalists, what they are and how they've been changing, and how that has also led to opening us up to fake news. So journalists have long been considered a watchdog of the government. They've been called the fourth estate, a sort of fourth branch of the government that does sort of a checks and balances on the government. That has been diminishing, or it has been diminishing for years, even though journalists in an American Journalist Survey just a couple of years ago said that it was more important than ever, but also more difficult for them to accomplish. There's also a norm of objectivity. We expect and complain about journalists when they're not being objective, when they seem to us to be biased. And so what that's led to is journalists doing sort of a he said, she said, especially in politics type of reporting. This person said this person said this, and then they use their news values. Politicians and others will use the news values, the things that journalists focus on, conflict being one of those, to try to gain audiences. And so when we have this he said, she said sort of reporting, rather than calling people out on their inaccuracies or providing context, then we have more room for error. That's become worse as the pressure of time has increased, 24-hour news channels, and now social media. So that's led us to distrust the traditional news to fulfill their watchdog role, even when they are attempting to meet our other goals. At the same time, younger audiences, millennials, the ones who are using social media, have shown to prefer fake or satirical news, examples being Trevor Noah, Jon Stewart, John Oliver. And the reason they prefer it over traditional media is that they feel that traditional news is not relevant to their lives. It doesn't provide them the context that they need in order to understand or care about the news. So they want more context, they want more interpretation, and traditional news has not provided that for them. So that leaves them open to whatever is being provided in social media. With social media, 62% of people now are reporting that they get news from social media. And news organizations themselves, because of that move, that shift of audiences, have had to try to adapt to where audiences are. Dropping ad dollars, dropping subscriptions means we need to go where you are. And if we do that, it's going to mean that the way we go about getting and reporting news has to change too. For one, US journalists are relying heavily on social media themselves to check for breaking news, monitor what other news sites are doing, and that's going to lead to possibly more errors. They also need to adapt their content and the style of their presentation to reach their audience and to meet Facebook's and other social sites' algorithms. And so when they're changing their content and style, it leaves us open to other new types of content and presentation and style of reporting. And so we can't recognize it when fake news does come out as quickly as we might have otherwise under traditional ways of reporting. And then the basic tenets of professional journalism are also said to change. This idea of verification, the idea of investigative reporting, goes by the wayside in terms of trying to get more clicks. If your job as a journalist now relies on how many click-throughs you get, because people are now reading your story and you have to promote it, it's going to change the kinds of things you focus on. It's going to change the way you present that information. So sensationalism and more generic reporting instead of verification, investigation, and independence is likely to be a result. Let's see. We've also seen more citizen journalism and blogs in social media, and this has been seen as a good thing. More voices, more diversity online. So if we're getting news from citizens and from blogs, we're now also open to other types of news sources rather than traditional media, which again leaves us a bit open to other types of news, including fake news. So last bit from me for now is that we also have a pretty low media literacy for audiences right now. Spending so much time in social media can skew our interpretation. And it can increase our message filtering. We are so overloaded with information that it's not possible for us to process all of it diligently. And so we're skimming, and it makes possible things with interesting headlines. And there's been studies that show that most of the time we're not even reading things, we're passing it along based on reading a headline, looking at an image, and we think other people will be interested in it. So it can skew our interpretation, it can increase our message filtering out other kinds of information. And now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Bohn-Gettler and have her talk about the psychology behind why fake news is sticky with us.
All right, thank you so much. So I think Dr. Berg did a really great job of laying the groundwork for some of the changes that have happened in the media industry. And then now I'm really going to think about, okay, so if this is the case, if we know that information out there is fake, why is this playing such a role in our lives? Why can't we just get over it, realize it's fake, and not remember it anymore? So I'm going to figure out how this works. Okay, I'm going to frame all of this as fake news interacting with the way our minds work in a continuing spiral. So we have encounters with fake news and misinformation, and then this interacts with how the regular cognitive processes that we use when we work with information in our mind. Now, the cognitive processes that we use work beautifully for accurate information. But unfortunately, in fake news, we have a lot of inaccurate information, but we end up using the same types of cognitive processes. Now, how we think about things and how we structure information in our minds and in our memories does not operate in a vacuum. Our beliefs play a very important role in that, such that we tend to engage in belief-biased processing where we selectively expose ourselves to particular information, and this can result in echo chambers. And echo chambers are situations in which beliefs can be amplified or reinforced because they're repeated in this closed system. And in this closed system, competing ideas can't enter. And so you really just end up going back and forth in this cycle through and through. And so we have selective exposure with these echo chambers, which then reinforce the misconceptions that we might have. And then we're further confronted with other types of news, social media posts, et cetera, that continue on in this spiral going downward. So to structure what I'm going to share with you today, I'm going to first talk about how we organize information in our memories, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the cognitive biases that we engage in that, like I said, can be quite helpful for certain types of information, especially for accurate information, but not so helpful for inaccurate information. And then I'll give you a little bit more detail about belief-biased processing. All of these I could teach an entire course on, so this is going to be the very short, the very short version. But I wanted to put all of this in the context of this story that just came out last week. A flight crew, meaning the pilots, take a knee, leaving the New Orleans Saints stranded on the runway. So this looks like it could potentially be truthful. It has some truthiness to it. You see that you probably know that the New Orleans Saints are an NFL football team. There's been debate lately because of protests during which NFL players are taking a knee during the national anthem. And in this story, they said that the pilots of the plane were veterans who were offended by these protests, so that they counter-protested by not flying them, and then the New Orleans Saints missing their game. Even the picture shows their plane grounded on the runway. Well, this is a deliberate hoax, and in fact, in the fine print of the bottom of this particular website, they claim that it's a deliberate hoax. So now that I've told you that, why can't you just forget this? Why can't you just forget this information? Can you just say, well, you told me it's not true, so isn't that good enough? And unfortunately, the research in psychology shows that just knowing something is untrue is not enough. Being exposed to misinformation, whether you know it's true or not, can lead to the formation of misconceptions, which then lead you to become even more resistant to changing beliefs, and can also hamper critical thinking. In addition, this leads to misinformed decisions, and it has really important societal implications. So as Dr. Berg talked about, we live in a time where anybody can publish something on the internet and try to make it appear valid. And even elementary school kids can go onto Google, and with a few keystrokes, they can find information that's both accurate or inaccurate. So this really leads us to the need for a cultural shift to build informed citizens. Even Thomas Jefferson famously quoted, "The cornerstone of a democracy rests on the foundation of an educated electorate." And I would argue that an educated electorate includes not only being able to check the credibility of your sources, but also being self-reflective about how our minds work and being aware of the biases that we have. So, again, why can't we just forget this fake news story about the New Orleans Saints airplane being grounded? Well, when we encode information into our memories, it gets encoded into something called a semantic network, which has all the different ideas and concepts in our mind and how they are related to one another. So in the middle of this particular semantic network, we have the news story that a pilot took a knee and grounded the plane. This is going to activate other related things in your mind, such as your knowledge of the NFL, your knowledge of the national anthem, because taking a knee is related to protests and it happens during the national anthem. It will likely activate your knowledge of racial injustice and different groups that are working to protest racial injustice, such as Black Lives Matter, the civil rights movement. It will also likely activate your knowledge of airplanes and pilots, and that pilots often are veterans but aren't always veterans. Now, something that I did not mention in discussing this news story was the name Colin Kaepernick. Now, he's the original person who did the Take a Knee protest, but you likely thought of him. And I wanted to bring that up because it demonstrates that automatically our minds engage in a spread of activation process where when we think of one concept, we automatically think of other things that are related to it. So when you have inaccurate information placed into your mind, it gets put into this very intricate and interconnected web where it's connected to a lot of other things, and thinking of anything related to it can actually activate that concept. So you can't just pull out one concept from your mind, especially when it's connected and deeply embedded to other things in your mind. So that's one reason why we can't just forget this fake story. And so then you might ask the question, well, are we just lazy? And we're not lazy, but we do prefer mental shortcuts. As Dr. Berg said, we are constantly confronted with a ton of information at once, and we have to find ways to navigate it. Now, I have this very scary graphic, and don't worry, I will not read every word on it. But this lists all of the different mental shortcuts or cognitive biases that we use to help us process information. There are 188 different ones that are verified in psychological research as being used. When we're confronted with too much information, we have to decide what to focus on. Or alternatively, if we are confronted with a situation where there's not enough information, we have to fill in the gaps to try to figure out, okay, how can I interpret what's happening here? Sometimes we're in situations where we have to act fast and make snap decisions. So again, cognitive heuristics or cognitive biases come into play. And we also have to sometimes make decisions about what should I focus on and remember. Now, I'm not showing this to say, oh my gosh, the human mind is completely terrible. But I am showing it to say that some of these work really well for accurate information, but not so well with inaccurate information. And I'm going to hone in on just a couple of these cognitive biases or heuristics that we use when we are confronted with misinformation. So first of all, because we have so much information coming at us constantly, we often choose the path of least resistance, where we assume that what we hear is accurate and credible. And especially if it looks like it could be truthful, then we assume that it's truthful. It's particularly difficult for us to identify a lie when it's mixed in with truth. It kind of reminds me of that concept of truthiness. And so especially when something looks truthful, we just assume that it's credible. We also tend to remember inaccurate information as if it's true. And this is, again, because of those automatic activating relevant concepts in our mind type of process. There's something called an availability heuristic, that if we can remember something more quickly, it feels like it must be true, and so therefore we think that it's true. Another heuristic that we use is something called fluent retrieval, that if you hear something repeated often enough, it starts to feel like the truth. Now, of course, we know that if 50 million people say a foolish thing, it's still a foolish thing, but our mind does not necessarily process that because we thought of it so quickly and we've heard it from so many sources that therefore we think it's true. And I think that's a particular challenge with the social media echo chamber that happens because the fake news stories are getting shared so much, as Dr. Berg discussed. Now, in addition to using these cognitive biases, we tend to then become overconfident in our knowledge about something, especially if we have very little knowledge in that topic. And this is something that Dunning and Kruger actually won the Nobel Prize for back in 2000, where they found that people who have very little to no expertise are highly confident in their knowledge and their ability to effectively make decisions. As they gain more knowledge, that confidence starts to drop. And then as they start to reach the expert level, then the confidence starts to come up. But I would like to point out that the confidence level of experts is still not as high as the confidence level of novices, likely because experts are aware of what they don't know and of the complexity of the topic, whereas novices are, in a sense, ignorant of their ignorance. And because of their overconfidence, they're more likely to make mistakes and decisions based on that and then be unaware of the mistakes that they've made. So I've mentioned that cognitive processing doesn't occur in a vacuum. This speaks to the important need for us to be self-reflective about all of our cognitive biases and cognitive processes, and to also acknowledge that all of us have our own beliefs that can change the way in which we interact with information, and they can present barriers to overcoming misconceptions. In particular, as I mentioned earlier, belief bias processing can lead to selective exposure and selective attention, where we pay attention to individuals and news stories that are aligned with our beliefs. And Facebook, in fact, even has algorithms where it pays attention to what you like and what you don't like, and then tries to present you with stories that align with what you like, which can further create this echo chamber that's going on. And when we encounter belief-consistent information, things that align with what we believe, it maps really well onto that semantic network that I described earlier, because we've structured our knowledge in our minds in a way that's consistent with that semantic network. So then we end up having better integration into our memory, which improves our memory. We're more likely to believe it, and we're more likely to engage in confirmation strategies in which we try to find information that supports what we believe. Now, if you can break out of the echo chamber and come across belief inconsistent information, this feels uncomfortable. It results in something called cognitive dissonance. And it's harder to actually integrate that information into your semantic network, because it's much easier to integrate something that fits with it than to have to dismantle the entire semantic network. So then we tend to engage in disconfirmation strategies, where we try to refute or say what's wrong with the information that's not consistent with our beliefs. I'd also like to point out that these belief-based types of processing tend to be more likely to occur if the belief that you're looking at is core to your identity, which happens more often with political beliefs. And so Dr. Court will be talking more about the political implications of this as well. So unfortunately, it's very difficult to overcome this spiral. I feel like the person that's bringing you all the bad news today. Simply warning somebody, hey, you're going to read something and it contains inaccuracies, doesn't necessarily help. Encouraging people to retrieve relevant knowledge or to activate relevant knowledge in their memories doesn't always help. Presenting material more slowly so that people have more time to think about it doesn't always help. And just hoping that the memory will fade with time doesn't always help. So I've given you a really grim picture, but I do want to leave you with some hope, just because I'm an educator, so that's what I feel like I should do. We can stop the spiral. I think being aware of these cognitive biases and belief-based biases can help us to engage in self-reflection. Knowing what you now know about how information is structured in memory, it's really important that you work to reinforce the correct knowledge that's in there, identify where incorrect knowledge is, and then try to engage in conceptual change so you can strengthen all of the connections to the correct knowledge in your memory. And then, of course, try to avoid incorrect information in the first place. Be very wary of truthy falsehoods. As Dana Drazenovich will talk about, you should be constantly checking your sources, and I'll let her cover that. But in general, we have an ethical imperative to work to create a culture of critical literacy. So more on this later. Now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Court to talk about some of the political and social implications of fake news.
So looking at this, first I'll kind of go over specifically what happened within the Charlottesville situation, and then we'll kind of look at some of these broader implications that this has for our society as we have winnowed down into these echo chambers even further. So one of the things that we saw emerge even more during the 2016 election especially was that there was kind of a growing need or desire to be associated with groups that were kind of this anti-government, both on the left and the right. So we saw this with the Bernie Sanders resurgence, and we saw this as well with the Trump supporters. Now, those in and of themselves didn't necessarily have to be seen as extreme as some of these other groups, but those other groups saw that as a potential mouthpiece for them, or as potential for them to become more mainstream and pull out from these fringes and to see that those people are just like us and begin to reemerge and become more acceptable. So they basically were kind of moving from these comment boards in different blogs and things like that out to the streets. What we saw was, for example, with the Unite the Right rally. They organized as a Facebook event initially, much like many events are using those kind of mainstream social media sites, just like the groups on the left that counter-mobilized and met in a different part of town, but met at the same park ultimately did. So they start out as like these groups mobilizing through the other groups that they may be a member of. They get picked up by these other sorts of, in this case, conservative sites, the Daily Stormer. They built the anticipation for this event. They brought people from all over the country to join together to join the rally. And what that social media does is it allows for this quick spread of propaganda and information so that you can instantaneously, if you need to switch where you're meeting, or if you need to bring more people to the rally and get people excited about it, you can instantaneously post to these sites and get people there. Now, following the event, we see both sides winnow down into their echo chambers. So if you look at, here's an article posted by Breitbart. So this is a conservative news site that has been pulled out from being kind of seen as more of a fringe news site to being more pulled more mainstream as it's gotten more and more attention since, especially since the inauguration. And what you see is if you've ever gone to any of these sites, the comment boards are upsetting. I had to actually pan quite some space before I could find something that was postable, and it's still highly questionable. A lot of the language used on these things. That's a place, too, where people mobilize. That's a place where people meet one another. They're able to then use those connections that they draw from these comment boards and finding people that are replying to their comments and feeding into this. And that begins to build even more momentum and more extremism. We saw this fake news stories that were brought up earlier, where you have, in the aftermath, these stories are then spread, where you have, again, the Brennan Gilmore, who posted the video of the car slamming into the counter-protesters. The conspiracies ran rampant, and they're able to then use their social networks and their connections to spill that information quickly out there. We saw this, too, with the after the Vegas shooter. The first stories that emerged were that he had recently converted to Islam and that he pledged his allegiance to ISIS right before shooting all of those innocent people at the concert in Vegas. So these are quick, fast, and they get out there before you can even find the corrections, because they're finding new sites, and they are they are spreading them before you can even begin to kind of get ahead of them from the standpoint of like the Facebook trying to stop them from spreading and things like that, and the Google searches and things. Now, this is not isolated to only the right. As we mentioned before, people have had much more luck with getting the conservative side, an extreme conservative side, to spread the fake news stories. And that was, we've seen that with the young high school students sitting in Macedonia, creating websites and creating on both sides just fake news stories, just because they wanted to make the ad money. And so these kids were creating these stories, and they found very quickly that the stories on the right that were spreading made them more money. So they kept going in kind of that direction. But the left is not innocent in all of this either, right? So there are instances where the left has also kind of made missteps. In this case, we see with the Twitter handle, the Yes, You're a Racist, where they, following the event, they had identified, they said specifically, if you recognize any of the Nazis marching in Charlottesville, send me their names, profiles, and I'll make them famous. And so they went out and they identified, many people kind of worked together to identify these people, and some of them ended up losing their jobs, things like that. But there was also instances where, like the gentleman on the right with Arkansas Engineering a t-shirt on. That one, they reached out and said, any Arkansas engineering folks recognize this guy? And it turns out that they identified it as a professor from Arkansas who is an engineering professor. And so he received a phone call from sitting on his couch in Arkansas from the university saying, where have you been this weekend? And he said, sitting at home in Arkansas. And so he was misidentified, was getting death threats and all sorts of, he couldn't even go home because of kind of this echo chamber going after him with actual misinformation on identifying him. So when we look at kind of these hate groups in a very classic sense, they're everywhere. Right? These more extreme fringe groups are everywhere. We're seeing some of them, in a sense, starting to remove their hoods and starting to feel more and more comfortable going out on the streets. And so it's important to understand that, yes, there are some areas like Charlottesville area of the country where you see more concentrations, but we're not innocent in all of this either. You know, state of Minnesota, we have 10 identified hate groups as well. And so this isn't just kind of like a Southern issue, or it just isn't it's everywhere. It's absolutely everywhere. Now, the technology companies and some of these like social media companies are trying to figure out how to respond to this. Do they have some responsibility in helping these groups spread and be able to get more followers and get more people to join their groups? Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, they've tried to go out and ban certain groups. A lot of times they'll find ways around this, but they have definitely felt pressure, these groups. It was said that what we're going back to is kind of snuffing out of dissonant views. It reminds me of the Soviet Union, right? But when they don't snuff out these dissonant views, there's kind of a sense of responsibility that they feel as well for allowing groups to use their platform. So this is kind of a big ongoing debate of how much kind of filtering or how much control should these companies have over, and responsibilities should these companies have over how their technology is being used. Now, looking at this kind of at the broader mass level, and looking at these ideological silos that have been created, we see things like people actually not just in their social media feeds, but in their daily lives, wanting to be kind of separate in their silos. So here, if you look at the left-hand column, it's important to me to live in a place where most people share my political views. Now, we see the people that are more intensely on either end of the spectrum, those consistently conservative or those consistently liberal, indicating that they are more likely to say that they want to be in these living amongst like people. The consistently conservative being half of those that identify in that group wanting to even live with people that agree with them more. Now, when we look at then also the close friends, wanting to share their political views or having most of their friends share their political views. 63% of those who are consistently conservative have a preference towards having those people, their friends, identify similarly to them. Now, this is kind of consistent with a lot of the literature, psychological literature we see on the brain actually being kind of different for a conservative than a liberal. The things that, the parts of the brain that value things like loyalty and stability and fear-based processing are more likely to be kind of larger, literally larger and more active in that conservative brain. So we kind of expect to see that be even more intense than the liberal side. Now, we still see people like wanting, almost half of liberals, of those consistently liberal people wanting to be with like-minded people. But we would also expect to see that be a little bit lower when we look at kind of how the liberal mind operates. And they are typically better at processing information that causes them to have cognitive dissonance. So we would expect to see that. But it's still high. But it's still quite high. Now, when we look at this kind of beyond just kind of that silo and wanting to seek out your silo, we're also seeing things grow more intense in those silos. So when you ask the question, like Pew Research Center did, where do you view the other party as a threat to the nation's well-being? We begin to see something emerge. So if we're just looking at the favorability scores over time, so this is 1994 is the far left on each of these graphs, 2004 is the middle, and on the right end of both of these is 2014. So spanning over the last 20 years. 20 years ago, only about 17% of people that identified as either Democrat or Republican said that they had very unfavorable views of the other side, right? And that's what we would kind of expect. 10 years prior, or 10 years before that, or after that, we see a jump. We actually see a jump. So in 2004, we see 29% of Democrats and 21% of Republicans saying that they had a very unfavorable view of the other side. And what's fascinating is that 10 years after that, so currently, we're dealing in a time where 38% of Democrats have very unfavorable views of the other side, and then 43% of Republicans have very unfavorable views. And what they started asking recently is whether or not you actually didn't just have an unfavorable view, but what was the intensity of that unfavorable view of the other side? And do you see them as a threat to our well-being, our nation's well-being? And 27% of Democrats and 36% of Republicans actually see the other side as a threat to our domestic way of life. So that is just being perpetuated and it's growing. And we're seeing this, when we break this down, we actually see that those people who are more politically engaged. So here we've got those people who, again, live in their neighborhoods. For those people who are more engaged, they see that as an even bigger threat to the other party as an even bigger threat. And we see this especially for Republicans. And as we break that down, the more engaged they are, the more intense those feelings are. And then, of course, we see kind of when we're looking at this in the aggregate, the blue indicating kind of where the median Democrat lies, and the red being where the mean Republican lies, or median Republican lies, 94, 2004, and 2014. We're seeing that widening and that spread between the groups. This has huge implications for everything from who we're electing, what kinds of policy, if we can even pass policies, if we can even have conversations with one another. So one of the things we found in 2016 was that a lot of people, and think about your own kind of behavior on social media too, a lot of people unfriend or unfollow one another if they're tired of reading articles on the other side. We're not even being exposed to a lot of these. So now that we have kind of a sense for where we rest right now in society, we'll go ahead and we'll talk about how we can begin to undo a lot of these challenges that we're facing right now as a society. So I'll hand things over to you.
That might be like a tall order, but
If anyone's up for it.
yeah.
Which one do I push?
Just push that
Where's the space bar?
Just throw your whole hand on it.
I hate this. Come here. There it is. Okay, now I have to escape. All right. Why is it not doing this? It's not going back. There we go. Okay.
Yeah, and if you just put it over here and just use the arrow to go forward or back,
Gotcha.
that should do it for you.
Looking at that. Okay. Sorry about that. This computer is kind of, it's a PC laptop and I don't like it. I'm Dana Drazenovich and I teach in communication and also FYS. And I've actually just this year started really plugging a lot of this into my FYS class because I feel like it's really, really important for those of us who are choosing to be college educated, those of us who are choosing to come to a liberal arts school where we engage in civil discourse, to engage in our online communities that way as well, okay? So what I'm gonna talk about today is we're going down to the practical stuff, like that I can do something about this because that's kind of my specialty. And we're gonna talk about how you can recognize fake news. We're gonna talk about how you can report fake news. We're gonna talk about how to recognize your own echo chambers, ways to get out of those echo chambers, ways to do some fact checking. So I know in a little bit, everybody here who has Google Chrome is gonna open their laptop and do something, but that's okay, because I have some pretty cool tools for you. Okay, the bottom line is that we have a lot of responsibility, I think, as consumers of information, as people who are educated, and it does take a little research. It does require you to leave your comfort zone, but you can learn to spot fake news and you can learn to exit those echo chambers. I'm not suggesting that you need to fact check everything you read, but the stuff that you're gonna share, the stuff that might have an impact on your viewpoints of important things, you should definitely be spending a little bit of extra time. Okay. So the first thing we want to talk about is recognizing fake news, because as you've learned, there's a little bit of it out there, and it's actually a frightening level of fake news that's out there. And so the first step, and there's a great organization called factcheck.org. I've got a handout for you guys with some of these websites and stuff on it, so you can take it with you. And but factcheck.org and PolitiFact both have a list of fake, hoax, imposter news sources, and it's a huge list. It's a frighteningly huge list, but it's something worth looking at if you're just a little bit interested in seeing what those look like. And so when you're looking at information, you really need to think about where is this coming from? Like Dr. Berg told you, there's all these imposter sites that sound like a real newspaper or news website, but they're not quite. So you have to think about that. And you also have to, when you're considering the source, if this is something you're gonna hit share on, if this is something that's gonna impact your perception, you've got to do a little digging, please. For example, there is a group called the Institute for Historical Review, and they put out all kinds of information. And on the face of it, they look like a normal organization. They're a nice nonprofit, they publish their own journal, but if you Google them, do a little extra research on them, you're gonna find out that they're a hate group that has literature trying to convince people that the Holocaust didn't happen, okay? Do you want to spread information on Facebook and Twitter by this group? You do not probably wanna be that person. And so that's why it really does pay to sometimes take that extra step, okay? There's a really great little graphic here about spotting fake news. As you can tell, it takes a little bit. But to echo what we've heard before, read beyond the headline is a huge one. Because sometimes the headlines are just clickbait. Sometimes it's a bait and switch where what's in the headline is completely different from what you're gonna find in the rest of the information. So give it a read. I mean, how many of you have shared a Facebook meme with a funny photo on it only to realize that it had an actually really offensive message and you didn't even read it and you just went, ugh. Happened to my brother, he offended my whole family. Way to go, buddy, Willy Wonka's not that funny. Also, it does pay if to check the author, who wrote this, and if you can't find out, that's kind of a problem. Supporting evidence. A lot of times what you will see with fake news is a lack of actual factual backbone. It's all opinion. There's no fact that you could actually go back and research to see if it's indeed true. And then checking the date, because what happens a lot is stuff just gets regurgitated over and over and over. So some of the things that you actually need to do is differentiating satire from actual news. You guys are probably actually better at it than some of the news sources out there. I don't know if you remember this, but last year, the year before, there was it went all over mainstream news that Obama called Putin a jackass at some meeting. And it actually came from a satire column from the New Yorker, and for the Borowitz report, and for some reason, the people who kept spreading it didn't like go back and look and see that he writes satire, and it's very clearly labeled as such, as if a president would call another world leader a jackass in a world meeting. You know what I mean? But there it was everywhere, and one of my FYS students brought it up in our, right? Okay, never mind. I mean, that was in the old days. Yeah. But one of my students brought it up, and we do headline sharing, and I was like, I hadn't heard that. So then I did some digging, and I'm like, oh my God, it's fake news, which we didn't use that word even then. Being aware of your own biases is really important too, as everybody has pointed out to you so thoroughly. Reading something that agrees with you, you just go, oh yeah, it must be true. But sometimes that's not the case. So I think if you can really be thoughtful and reflective about where your biases are, that will help you see through some of the stuff that's out there that is absolutely not accurate. Also, I was just going to bring up one little thing. I don't have it on my slide here, but if something looks not very well photoshopped, it's probably fake news. This one, you guys, my dog could have done this Photoshop. Okay. This is something that circulated around Charlottesville this summer, and it's white supremacists who killed protesters, a Democrat, and who visited Obama in the Oval Office. Well, the name that they used with this fake news was indeed a guy named Jason Kessler, who was indeed a white supremacist, who was indeed a former liberal, and Obama's supporter. But that's where it ends. A, he wasn't the guy who drove into the crowd and killed anyone, and B, the guy in this photo is actually Will Ferrell. They photoshopped his face out. So it ended up going all over the internet. So, you know, and it's again, it's kind of that, oh, look what the bad liberals did. And on the other side, you'll see like, look what the bad conservatives did. I just like this example because the photoshopping is so atrociously bad. Easiest way to keep track of fake news, you guys. I follow these 3 sites on my social media: factcheck.org, politifact.com, and snopes.com. They regularly post the stories that they have done investigative research on to find out if they're fake or not. PolitiFact has a great scale that goes from true to mostly true all the way to liar, liar, pants on fire. And they do a really good job of it. So these are 3 I happen to use, and it's not a bad idea to follow those because it helps you not look stupid, frankly, when you're getting the big fake news stories in your feed as fake news, or true stories that are being presented as fake news, but they're not. Another thing that I really, to help you identify fake news, the AP, the Associated Press, it's a worldwide news bureau. It puts out a not real news, a look at what didn't happen this week. And that's on there. I follow AP News on Facebook, and that's how I got this post. And again, it's a really good middle of the road fact checking. So I would recommend that, you guys, for all of you. A few more tips, okay? You know, paying attention to the domain name and the URL, because what it says at, in the headline or in the masthead and what it actually the domain name is could be 2 very different things. And obviously names like, the flaming liberal and the flaming conservative would maybe be a dead giveaway that it might have some inherent bias. Reading the about section is a really good idea. In fact, this is really funny because when I saw this on one of the fact check sites, Trump signing executive order stripping NFL of nonprofit status. I thought this could go either way. This could be liberal fake news or conservative fake news. But what it turns out is I went to the About, I found this on a fact check site, but when I went to the About Us page, it says this article was written by Butch Mannington. The About box says that Butch Mannington is sick and tired of liberals trying to take away freedom and ruin America, and he makes no secret of it. Okay? Okay, so we know that Butch has a little bit of bias built into what he does. That doesn't mean he's right or wrong. It means that maybe we ought to check on the accuracy of this post. And it turns out it's not true. The NFL became a nonprofit voluntarily, I want to say a couple years ago. Who knows what Trump is signing in this photo? Cool tool, reverse searching an image on Google. Anyone remember that image of the shark floating in on the Houston highway? All you have to do, you can either you go to images.google.com, you can either drag it in and drop it, you can upload the image, you can copy and paste the URL or right click on the image, and Google will back search it for you. And if it's fake, it's gonna come up with all kinds of fake that have been circulated on the internet. So that's a really cool tool that I like. And my big tip is one of the most effective ways to combat fake news is just not share it. I really don't think any of us wants to be culpable in spreading inaccurate information. I don't think there's any benefit to society to doing that, and or to you. So there are some ways that you can decide whether something is share-worthy. Here's a cool little poster I found actually today from the Newseum, which is a journalism organization. And I mean, they're just asking you to check if it's real. If it's not real, if it doesn't entertain or raise awareness, if it isn't supported by fact, if it's opinion but not clearly labeled as such, if it's not well made, if it's inherently clearly biased or sneakily biased, and if it's not supported by facts, I'm going to say, I put that in there twice because that's an important piece. I'm going to say go ahead and don't share that. And this is a really cool little poster. You can actually go to the Newseum site and download the poster they want to share. Better yet, if you see something that appears to be fake news to you for real, you can report it. Twitter does not have that mechanism yet. I've seen stories where they've been talking about considering it, but the last story I saw said they have no date. They're not going to implement one at this time. Facebook, however, does really quick. All you have to do is look for the little drop-down arrow in a post in the corner, which got cut off here. Click that little drop-down arrow, and then it's what's going on. Just click it's a false news story. Mark this post as false news, hit done, and you're done. And it goes to Facebook, okay? Facebook is trying to filter out some fake news. They are in a very weird position right now. Who knows how this is all going to pan out, but Facebook is partnering with PolitiFact to try to head off some of the fake news that's circulating. So it's worth your time to report it, because if enough people do, they're going to look into it. So that's something you can really do. Another thing you can really do is get out of your echo chamber. Here's the part where you're probably going to pull up your computer right away. All right, you guys, if you look at these two web photos from Charlottesville, you think these people have the same kinds of friends on Facebook and follow the same feeds? No, they exist in very clear information silos, boom bubbles. And the interesting thing is a lot of the people above were very surprised when the people below started having these, white supremacist marches and things like that, because a lot of us are so out of that bubble, we don't even realize that we didn't realize how strong that force was in our society, okay? And then, boom, there it was in full force. And I'm not suggesting that you start following white supremacist sites, because that's pretty awful. But I do suggest that you take an inventory of your own social media and who you are friends with and what you follow, and then look at sites on the opposite end of the spectrum. I'll show you something cool. I have a couple graphics. There's a variety of graphics that show how news media break down. This one has, mainstream, it goes liberal to super liberal, conservative to super conservative, complex all the way down to simple. And it can help you if you look at the sources you regularly look at or you follow on social media. If you're way over to the right or the left, it wouldn't kill you to take some from the middle and from the other side, just to open your eyes to those other viewpoints. Nobody says you have to change your vote, okay? But if you're opening your perspective to those other viewpoints, at least you can maybe understand what the other side is thinking and where people are coming from. So these are just a couple out there. None of these is perfect, but they're pretty good, frankly. And then here's the fun one, I think. There's a website called politecho.org. And if you go to that website, if you're using Google Chrome, and you click on the little icon, what it will do is it will take your Facebook, it's a Google extension, a Chrome extension, it will take your Facebook and it will create a bubble map like that. First of your friends and where they fall politically, way left, way right, or in the middle, and you can actually mouse over and their names will pop up, which is pretty interesting. Then it takes you to the next stage, which is your news feeds, your information feeds, and things like that, and it does the same mapping. And it's really interesting, especially if you're not really well aware of where your friends stand, where you stand. You might be way more to one end or the other than you even realize. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It just means you need to know, okay, I'm missing a whole chunk of perspective out there. So that's kind of a cool thing to do. Another cool thing you can do is you can go to the Wall Street Journal's website. They have a tool called Blue Feed, Red Feed, and you can click on a number of topics: President Trump, immigration, executive orders, ISIS, and you click on that, and it gives you two feeds. One as a liberal would see it on their Facebook, and one as a conservative would see it on their Facebook, if they're following the traditional media that would line up with their ideologies. So that's really interesting too. And the last tool is Flip Feed. It's a Twitter thing. Again, it's a Google Chrome extension. And what you do when you go into Flip Feed and you just go to this website that's listed here, I believe it's on your handout, they'll take your Twitter feed, analyze it, and put you into somebody else's Twitter feed. Somebody who has a different ideology than you, and they suggest you do it multiple times because they don't want to pigeonhole you too much, but it's still really interesting to see how other people are seeing Twitter, and it can really open your eyes to what you're not seeing. And again, you guys, that self-awareness reflective piece is such an important part of this. So I would suggest you guys have a little fun and do that, because I think it's pretty fun. And the last thing I just want to mention is there's a little thing on Twitter called Echo Chamber Exit Day. And basically it's advocating that you take one day a week to exit your echo chamber, right? As everybody mentioned, we're so inundated with information. It's outrageous. So you can't look at every news source out there every day of the week to exit your echo chamber. But what you can do is one day a week you can go, all right, I'm going to read these three on the other side of the spectrum from me, or these three in the neutral part. Just to see what's there and how their perspectives are being presented, okay? This is tough stuff to navigate, you guys. And, I find it challenging, and I can't imagine how college students feel. But I think that, being aware of where your biases are and then actively seeking to check fake news before you share, to see where your own echo chambers are and try to actively get yourself out. It's cognitive dissonance. It's uncomfortable. It freaks me out. How many of you have unfriended someone on Facebook because of their political post? Oh my God, a whole half of my family could be gone. And I just have to make myself not, because I'm like, they're my friends and my family, and we've loved each other all these years. I have to just see where they're coming from. And I think that knee-jerk reaction is something we could really do well to stop. And just think about and maybe even engage in, dare I say it, civil discourse. A nice conversation. You're stupid is not a way to start that. Trump sucks, Obama sucks. That's not going to get us anywhere. Hey, interesting. I just read something that said exactly the opposite. Where's your source? Something like that. And you could spend your whole life on social media and not fight every battle. So pick and choose carefully. But that's what I have for you today. And again, that handout can take you to all those resources, or a lot of those resources. Use them. They're fun. We did them in my FYS class, and or one of them. We're going to do the other tomorrow. And it's really interesting to see where your stuff falls. So I will leave us there. If anybody has any questions for any of us or all of us, please raise your hand and we would be happy to try to answer them.
Of all the news sources out there, which one would you, in your opinions, would you find to be the one that reports the least fake news? Or at least not that partisan on either side? Oh, yeah.
Interestingly, these two graphics have different neutral, but the Associated Press does tend to show up in the neutral quite a bit. I think it's funny that USA Today does here and down there. It's like basic information. C-SPAN, oh, that's tough watching, but C-SPAN is definitely pretty neutral. Sorry, it's like there's no butter on that bread. It's just facts, man. And also Reuters, which is another news service. So those are three. I follow the AP pretty steadily because I find that their stuff comes from all over the world and there's a lot of good reporting there. Wall Street Journal's pretty good, leans a little right, but Atlantic, MSNBC, interestingly, just a little left on this one, super left on the other one, but CNN left on this one, neutral on the other. Ha!
I find it really concerning that you're recommending these technological tools and saying that it's up to individuals to make these choices when we're not necessarily the people who have the power in this relationship. I don't think you've really addressed the fact that President Trump is up there saying that real news is fake news and that sort of thing. And I think I'd like to hear your thoughts on what the responsibility of, say, Facebook or these media companies and what their responsibility is.
Yeah, and I see that. I see that right now we have a really big problem with the overall information coming at us. I just feel like as individuals, it's one thing we can do to feel like we're doing something to be active in the process. But I agree that there's more culpability above us, for sure. If anybody else wants, Kelly, is that something you can?
I agree with Dana. I think that Dana's given us some good sources to help us to take power until somebody else steps up. I would be hesitant to say that all of the social media sites have to be responsible for censoring everything that we see. I think we don't necessarily want them to censor everything that we see, in the sense that part of the internet is freedom of information. However, I do think they need to take some responsibility for the types of algorithms that they are propagating and in the ways that it benefits them instead of us. And I think that traditional media, traditional journalism needs to step up. I think that there has been enough backlash now that even though we have the fact-checking sites, it's still challenging for them to keep up on, as we have heard on all of the misinformation that's out there, because they're less well-funded, and that's on some of the ownership, right, of those media companies. I have seen more recently that there has been a change in journalism to try to react to this, and journalists are now creating what they're calling muscle paragraphs, and this gets at what Dana was talking about, check the sources, where they will now be including multiple sources, 4 or 5 sources that vet this information as accurate information. And it's sort of this reaction to, okay, you can trust us, because before we couldn't. We couldn't trust you. And so maybe there are some steps being taken, because they're going to have to step in there somewhere in order to gain our trust back. Because it's very easy to say, well, you can't trust mainstream media, they're fake news, because in the ways that they've been acting, sometimes it seems like they're propagating fake news.
And what Kelly said is right, too. There's a really fine line with how much control you want a third-party host like Facebook or Twitter to take over the information. And it's going to be really interesting to see how this plays out. And frankly, right now, I'm not sure how it's going to play out. And that's kind of why I took the tack of what we can do individually just to be in power of our own information coming at us and having some control over how we're seeing it and thinking about it. But you bring up a great point, and that is the question, if you ask me. The answers, unfortunately, are not there right now. It's gonna be interesting. Let's put it that way.
And one thing that I want to mention too is you brought up this idea of like fake news. We hear the president himself call things fake news constantly. And the way that we have defined fake news is what fake news is. there's been kind of a hijacking of that terminology to describe anything that doesn't agree with you, which is simply not what fake news is. And so that has been kind of a disturbing thing that has occurred too, from all the way from the top, from the president. I just saw today another like, oh, fake news, and you see the CNN fake news. It's become kind of the thing to say if it's something that might be against you, which is absolutely not what it actually is, right? So I think that's a great point that you bring up, and one that I think we should stress as well.
I just feel like we can't leave without commenting about Russia. I mean, right? I mean, it's not just like people making money, right? I mean, there's a foreign government manipulated Facebook, Twitter, who knows what else, in order to try to change and influence presidential and probably lots of other more local elections. And like, so it's, I mean, that's. I don't know what to do about it, but I do think that people need to be aware that there are people actively trying to manipulate them, not just take their money.
Oh, yeah. I mean, some of the fake news is it's just, I want clicks. But some of it is very, very calculated and very, very dangerous.
And what makes it particularly disturbing is this notion that once that fake news is out there, then people do believe it because it's integrated into their memories. And so I think becoming more and more aware and recognizing when those things are happening is absolutely critical, yeah.
So, I mean, you do see the tension between what you're saying and what Dana's saying.
Yes.
Okay, right, everyone else saw that too, right? On the one hand, there's this idea that if you, once the misinformation enters your brain, it kind of sticks there. On the other hand, Dana's saying, well, go read people that we know InfoWars is going to give you fake information. We know that, right? So I don't know how you want to balance
Well, one of the things that I tell my students, right, is not to go to InfoWars necessarily. It's to, when you're looking at this, I am going to follow things in the middle. A bulk of my things are in the middle, but I'm also going to do stuff like kind of skirt over to the right a little bit, but on those things that are have more information and things like that, I turn on Fox News after watching a debate. I also go to MSNBC and see what both of those sources. I have my students do an entire assignment where they have to watch Fox News for an hour. They have to watch MSNBC for an hour. I see some heads nodding. It changed your life clearly. And then have to go through and look at the framing, the priming, and the agenda setting on both of those. Yes, no, I know. But then you begin to kind of understand. So I think it's valuable to follow the right and the left sources within kind of that scope of still being somewhat more acceptable. Yeah. So
No,
I'm not saying that you. Yeah.
Oh, no,
And I don't think that's what she.
That's
she
why I
meant,
picked the ones
right?
that rate them from complex and analytical and meets high standards to basic and sensational or clickbait. Because the bottom ones, and I should have said that more clearly, but I was running out of time, the bottom ones are the ones you would want to avoid. So the two charts I pulled rate them that way as well. So you'd want to stick with the ones that most, like a variety of charts rate as, complex analytical meet high standards. I'm not telling anyone to go to the junk on the, in the wave fringes or anything like that. I kind of meant like on the other side within decency.
But I think what you're getting at is this notion that there's conflicting messages here where we're saying, okay, once something is in your memory, it's really hard to get out, but then we're also saying, but you have to do all these other things. So it's really this notion about trying to encourage our citizens to become more proactive about stepping out of their comfort zone and recognizing when they have these particular biases and when these other biases are coming from external sources. And it's not easy. So everything that I talked about was to say, this is not easy. There is hope, but we do actually have to be proactive about advocating for getting people to step outside of their comfort zones in order to do this and to be self-reflective. It's going to be a long uphill battle to do that, and I'd like to think that it's still hopeful and possible to do that. But that disconnect is certainly there, and I think it's important that we acknowledge it.
And Emily,
And I hate to get picking on the right, but I will. Because we know from Fox News, we know they've done study after study that show that people that watch a lot of Fox News end up with a lot of misinformation. They understand less than people that don't watch news at all. And so that looks like a very, and that's not super far right. And I'm not saying don't watch Fox News, because I just think there's a danger there if.
So then if you're reading sources in the middle, and if you're reading sources then slightly to the left as well, you can begin to recognize that for yourself as well. And that should be the goal, is not just be able to like sit there and take in information and absorb it and say that must be truthful, right? And so that's why I think it's important that we are following things in the middle, and that we are following things like slightly to each side, so that, and up higher on this chart.
Yep.
I literally give my students this chart and show them kind of like where the realm of acceptability sort of is, and responsibility. Those sources have more responsibility to be providing some evidence-based, they're not the clickbaits. They're not the things that are necessarily just trying to get the sensationalized headlines as much. So if you're following like The Hill and you see something that The Hill reports, I can then go in and say, okay, so what's the other side saying about this, right?
The hill is on the other side in the other chart.
Yeah, the thing is, yeah. I believe I mentioned that there was no such thing as the perfect chart, but it's at least a basic mapping. And some of the stuff is consistent from chart to chart.
I do think, again, it speaks to this ethical imperative to understand that an informed citizenry is more than just reading from multiple perspectives, but it's engaging in that hard self-work, and it's engaging in advocacy to help others learn how to do that kind of self-work and that self-reflection.
But you have to recognize you're in an echo chamber before you can get out of it.
Yep, absolutely.
Question for you is, are you sure that Russia, do you have any evidence that Russia is doing that?
Yes.
North
I mean, in the
Korea?
sense that I trust the CIA and FBI and other
You trust CIA and
agencies
FBI?
that- I know, it's a sad day, but yes, on this particular issue, it seems like there's a general consensus in the intelligence community. Think I'm like, IC, what does that stand for? Intelligence community.
Because I only hear that somebody say Russia is doing that. That was from the government, US government, saying Russia is doing that. I think Donald Trump may have done something on it too.
Facebook has also said that they've tracked a lot of ad money to Russia. So not only are the fake stories coming through our news feeds, they're being promoted, they're also coming through ads. And what this will look like in the end, but Facebook has recently, just in the last couple of weeks, said that they're planning to create a reporting system similar to the one that, I mean, they have had that reporting system for quite some time, but if certain sites have been reported frequently, they will not be, they will be frozen, and they will not be able to promote posts or put any money toward ad placement on Facebook until that's investigated. Of course, there are lots of ways that could be gotten around, right? It's challenging to keep up on that. But Facebook itself has said, yeah, this is where the money is coming from. I don't know, again, whether they are taking that money from taking the word of the government that this is where the money is coming from, if it's being funneled through some places, because it's not being clearly
When they
reported.
recently handed over that evidence, right? So we don't know what the result of all of that will be, but they're obviously complying. They handed over like 3,000 different ads from Russia, and they are, they're trying to help trace where the money is coming from and things like that. So we simply don't know exactly what the extent of that is. Well, no, that we know, that we do know. It's just a matter of who was it in Russia? Are these people in cahoots with anybody here in like the Trump campaign and things like that? Or with the Russian government themselves? We know it's Russia, though. I mean, that was confirmed by like...
I'm pretty sure we know that Putin was
Well, yeah, so we have some of these, but we don't have kind of the ultimate bigger picture sense for what ultimately, the details behind all of this are, and they're currently investigating that. But we know it's Russia.
Hillary lost.
What?
Can you tell me why Hillary lost?
I think you can
that's a
read
whole
a
nother
book
panel.
called What Happened.
Shannon.
Oh, I just wanted to ask because, especially later in the election and post-election, there's a lot of push on so-called mainstream media to say, for the sake of being balanced, you're reporting he said, she said, without really interrogating the validity of what different sides are saying, and a push for journalists to really call out the inaccuracies much more strongly. I guess I don't know what the question is, except...
I think they've decided to do that under President Trump, where they had been not doing it as much as they should have or could have been previously. I think that a lot of things, in a confluence of things, have created more of an effort on media's part. Of course, media don't like to be called out for not doing a good job, especially by the president that they now have to be friends with, who's now trying to keep them out. So they're going to go after that, and they're going to fact check things more, almost as a screw you sort of thing. But hopefully that will last for a long time in other ways, and for other politics, political issues.
And the
too.
thing is, Shannon, honestly, the fact-checking sites, I think they sprang up because news media weren't doing that. Because they don't just fact-check stories, they fact-check speeches, and that kind of, and all that too. And they've been around quite a while. So that's why I suggest following those, because they're actually doing what our mainstream news media used to do.
And I think it ties into what Kelly had to say earlier about the responsibility of, or people wanting context for their stories. So there's actually, in the psychology world, there's a ton of studies, huge meta-analyses done on the links between viewing violence through video games on the media and then actual rates of aggression. And the correlation between those is actually as high as the correlation between smoking and lung cancer. But when you read media stories reporting on, oh, does exposure to violent media actually increase violent behavior, they have this goal of providing both sides of the story, even when one side of the story has a lot more data behind it. And so this is something that's been going on for a long time across a lot of different areas, even outside of politics, that I think is really important, and it's something that we're going to have to grapple with. Yep, climate change is another great example of that. Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah.
Imbalance has become, or objectivity has become, two extreme sides, right? When there's multiple perspectives all over the place that we don't get to hear because it draws viewers and audiences and for a variety of other reasons.
It's a very complicated information landscape. So, I mean, I was just trying to help college students get a little step further in their media literacy, you know?
So basically don't try to take anything at face value, even with more trusted.
Not even with traditional media. Absolutely not. I teach a whole class on that. Right? Their goal is to bring you there in groups for advertisers. And if you're not one of the people that advertisers care about, they couldn't care less about you. You're not going to see content that's skewed in your favor. You might not see content at all with your perspective. So, yes.
But, I mean, if you actually go to the New York Times or the Guardian or whatever, I think that's fairly safe.
The New York, Wall Street Journal originally reported completely inaccurately about the 1994 genocide in Rwanda, so,
They're not always like 100%, right? I mean, the lead up to like war was not a good time. The New York Times, right? But it's definitely not. I mean, it's better than not knowing anything, right? I mean, you gotta start with something.
Go ahead.
I just have a question about, I don't know that things will change until there's repercussions for people spitting out whatever they want to say whenever they want to say it, especially higher up that are not supposed to be doing things like that. But when do you think repercussions will happen for somebody saying something that's completely false? You never hear really the backup of, oh, we've taken care of that, and I'm sorry I said that, so it's not true. I mean, there's no accountability anymore.
I think to some extent, for example, so we recently, a group that I'm involved in with St. Cloud, and they identified some speech in a radio station that was making fun of the Holocaust and Anne Frank, and we explored options and found that multiple, by documenting quotes and timestamps, we can make some hints to FCC, and we can also go to multiple human rights organizations to bring attention to this. Yes, this person over here has free speech, but so do I. And so utilizing that as a tool and as strength is very important to create that kind of balanced perspective so that we can highlight, these various media outlets that are creating an increased amount of problems for our society.
And the FCC will only go after broadcast outlets if someone has complained. However, the chair of the FCC is typically appointed by the current president, and that sways the way that the FCC interprets.
Are you here for the pre-law activity?
Sorry.
Yeah. Okay. We are
Thanks for coming.
Thank you, everybody.